Right, I think we should make a start to reward the virtuous and timely. So, good evening, everybody. A very warm welcome to this evening's Transport Planning Seminar, Transport Planning Society Seminar. My name is Ben Plowden. I'm chair of the Transport Planning Society. I'm also a visiting professor at UCL, and my day job is I'm an associate at PA Consulting. But before I went to PA, I spent about 20 years at Transport for London in a whole variety of different roles, planning and strategy, project sponsorship, travel demand management, amongst other things. So I've sort of been in this debate around changing travel behaviour, and particularly how do you reduce car use and car mileage, obviously in that case in an urban context, and that's something which TfL is still very actively thinking about, and I suspect will do so going forward if Sadiq Khan is re-elected today. So the Transport Planning Society, actually, quick straw poll, hands up if you're a member of the Transport Planning Society. Hands up if you're not and feeling very guilty. Good, okay. See me for membership form after the event, and we've got your name and your number, so we'll check you down. So the Transport Planning Society exists to do three things. One is to represent transport planners and the transport planning profession to a variety of audiences. Secondly, to support the professional development and skills of transport planners. And thirdly, to influence the transport policy and practice of both national, regional and local decision makers in the interest of pursuing a sustainable and decarbonised transport system. So the topic we're going to talk about this evening, led in a minute, I'll introduce Leo, by Leo Murray from Possible, is reducing traffic, what is possible? And Leo's going to give us a campaignist perspective on that question. And this seems to me an incredibly timely debate because we've got governments in Scotland and Wales, we think, at least for now, pursuing explicit traffic reduction targets, although let's see what happens now that we've lost Lee Waters in Wales and now that the SNP government is sort of potentially changing its direction. We've got the Mayor of London still has an explicit car reduction target in terms of mode shift over the next 20 years or so. We've had the debate around ULEZ in Outer London. There's been the debate in Cambridge around the congestion charging scheme that was being proposed there. So the question about whether and how you reduce total car distance travelled or total car kilometres or number of car kilometres per person is a very hot topic at the moment. And luckily, the topic for this autumn's Transport Planning Day that we're running in November is the road less travelled, the practicalities, policies, principles and politics of reducing car travel in the UK as opposed to in the subordinate member states. So what we're going to do is get Leo to talk for, I guess, about half an hour about his perspective on this question from a campaigner's point of view. Then we'll take Q&A for Leo from both you here in the room and people online. And then we're going to get up three very distinguished panellists and then have a sort of further debate about what you've heard Leo say. So I'll ask them to respond to what they've heard, and then we'll take further questions from you guys and people online. So without further ado, let me introduce our principal speaker, Leo Murray. Leo is a co-founder and director of innovation at Possible, the campaigning NGO. And Possible and Leo have been at the forefront of this debate for the last several years. They've done two major projects on slashing car use. They have a car-free cities programme working with London, Birmingham, Leeds and Bristol to think about how some of their traffic-blighted streets could be reimagined and repurposed. They have a global project called the Car-Free City Megacities Project with New York and Paris, thinking about how you address this question internationally. They've been working on what the future of Hammersmith Bridge might be like if you weren't assuming it should just revert to traffic use. And they're doing some work with the Active Travel Academy around low traffic neighbourhoods, another controversial now and hot topic. So without further ado, Leo, over to you to open and get us going, and then we'll come back to Q&A after that.
Brilliant. Thanks so much, Ben. Can everyone hear me okay? I'm not gonna do that. I don't think it's necessary. Brilliant. Thanks for that intro. That's lovely. It is an honour to be here. I love the Transport Planning Society. I think it's not the first time I've come to speak with you, but it's always great to have a room full of people who at least in theory know what they're talking about, because I do an awful lot of public engagement on an area that is not necessarily intuitive, and there are an enormous number of misconceptions, including amongst political decision makers. So I am going to be sharing insights from the last sort of 3-4 years of running the projects and campaigns that Ben was describing. So I'm just going to recap on the problem. This will be familiar to you. Transport's the biggest source of greenhouse gas emissions in the UK. That has been true for a few years. And as you can see, it did very little in terms of, it basically has not been going down since our baseline for greenhouse gas emissions in the UK. There's a dip. That's COVID. It's recovering to pre-COVID levels. Now, this is Climate Change Committee. They keep asking about this and not getting an answer. So this is their most recent progress report to Parliament. They still haven't made any progress on clarifying the role for car demand reduction. Right, there's domestic transport. Yeah, this was sort of clarity, I suppose, from the Roads Minister, Anthony Brown. This is in January this year. We don't think there needs to be a reduction in car use. That is not the message we are sending. And that is a slide from the Department for Transport's plan for drivers, which I'm sure you're all familiar with. So just to recap, the basic problem here, the reason why transport emissions have not been going down is there are too many cars travelling too many miles. And that's the most recent take on that. We know we'll be back up to pre-COVID levels and mileage before. No, we can't solve this exclusively with switching to electric vehicles. Even if all new cars being sold in 2030 are zero-emission vehicles, 40% of the fleet will still be conventional petrol and diesel vehicles. That's from the Green Alliance. There are any number of different expert sources. So I wrote a little briefing note which just pulls together all the different sources of analysis which reach the same conclusion, which is that overall car miles must fall very, very rapidly to achieve our climate goals. Now, the difference between 20 and 60%, that's different analyses, but it's also fundamentally how fast are we switching to electric vehicles? And to get close to the 20% end of that range, we would need policies that it supported a switch to EVs at Norwegian rates. We don't have those policies. We don't have plans to introduce them. We're not switching to EVs at the same rates Norway did. So the true figure is somewhere in the middle of that. This shouldn't be controversial. This is IMEC. This is just avoid, shift, improve. It's something that is extremely basic for people who work in this space. So this is just an example of a avoid, shift, improve type hierarchy. This is the IMEC transport hierarchy. It has proven to be extremely controversial, certainly with the ministers responsible. So if we need to reduce car miles very, very rapidly, this talk and most of our work today has focused on cities, and there is a good reason for that. Most of us live in cities, and most of the cars that we own are in cities. Alternatives to car use are trivial to achieve in cities. In fact, like effective alternatives that can meet people's mobility needs, it's very easy to do in dense built up, highly populated places, right? It's just not hard. Things can be walkable, cyclable. You can run a high frequency, good quality public transport and make a profit. It's like it just works really easily. And also, what doesn't work is cars in cities is a disaster. And even if climate change wasn't a thing, we would still be looking to design cars out of cities because they have just blighted cities in all sorts of different ways. So Possible is a charity that works on aspects of the climate crisis where people will have to live their lives differently, but which also doing something about those things will improve people's lives today. And so cutting car use in cities is right in the sweet spot for us. But it's also by far the most controversial thing we've ever worked on, as it turns out. This is London. So this is an official target. It's a formal target that Sadiq Khan set when he committed to net zero in 2030. So this is 27% is what he said. It includes quite a lot of offsetting. Offsetting doesn't work, so it shouldn't really be being relied on by anybody to meet climate goals. When I say it doesn't work, that's not just an opinion. That is like all of the evidence to date. There are no examples of carbon offsetting schemes delivering what they said on the tin or exceeding what they said on the tin. There are countless examples of carbon offsetting schemes under-delivering and failing to deliver what they said they would do. So the true figure in London would be much higher than that, almost certainly. This is a paper a recent paper from the Grantham Institute, which looked at this. They ruled out offsetting, and they adopted a net zero pathway that was more consistent with the Tyndall Centre's pathways, which allow for some growth in emissions from least developed countries, basically, so that they can meet basic needs in those countries. So if the UK adopted a pathway like that, and London was trying to adopt a sort of climate justice pathway, it's like an 85% cut in car miles in London is needed by 2030. So you might say, well, that's absurd, but that is just that's the backdrop here. So there's 4 key insights from this. Firstly, noisy backlash against traffic reduction is just inevitable. It's universal regardless of the approach taken. I have now, I've been either directly involved with, or I have read case studies of, or watched the progress of dozens and dozens and dozens and dozens of schemes, right the way down from single parking space all the way through to, citywide things. It's the same thing every time, right? It's not about scheme design. Once they bed it in, nobody ever wants to go back. Even at the outset, it's a majority and a plurality. It's not just one particular group of people who wants this stuff. Actually, most people support the change. But they're not motivated enough to actually weigh in to what is a very fractious space. So generally, they'll stay out of it. Controversy during the implementation, this is a really important piece of learning from some work we did with Westminster, does not translate necessarily, at least, into electoral outcomes at ballot box. So, beat for freedom. At every crossway on the road that leads to the future, each progressive spirit is opposed by 1,000 men appointed to guard the past. There's one of them there. I like that quote because it very much does characterise trying to do any work in this space, trying to make any progress. Now, I'm going to get into each of those 4 points, right? So, London congestion charge is a great example. If you'd had a referendum on a congestion charge before it was implemented, it would have lost and it wouldn't have happened. And central London would just sort of be cursed with perpetual gridlock. It was wildly contentious. It wasn't just Ken Livingstone's Tory opposition that hated it, it was unions as well. Westminster tried to take him to court over it. He pushed through and did it anyway. 8 months later, support had flipped. Majority of people liked it, and support only grew after that. This is a pattern that you see over and over again all around the world. We've got a report on this on the possible website. It's unbelievably consistent, to the point where we can't find a single example of an effective traffic reduction scheme anywhere in the world that did not face controversy and backlash when it was first proposed. So these are just some screenshots from a YouTube video from Amsterdam in the 70s, where this is a punch-up happening here. It's not Amsterdam wasn't Amsterdam. And then here is a very typical story from the BBC. Louth Park clips, the town in turmoil over street seats. That's a single parking space, right? Doesn't matter what it is that you're trying to do. If it involves reducing the utility of private car use, there will be people who are very, very angry about it. Likewise, we can't find any examples of effective traffic reduction schemes anywhere in the world being removed more than 2 years after being implemented because of ongoing public opposition. Now, I've said this a few times, and I've had people go, oh, but what about this? What about that? Here's a couple of examples, right? London's western extension of the congestion charge was scrapped, and it was scrapped after quite a long time, nearly 4 years. But by the time they consulted on scrapping it, the majority of consultation responses said, no, keep it. But they did it anyway because it had been a manifesto commitment of Boris when he was elected. Likewise, Lutfi Rahman in Tower Hamlets, I'm sure people have been following what's been happening there. He got elected in 2022 promising to remove all the low traffic neighbourhoods and the cycle lanes. I mean, things that are millions of pounds of public realm reconfiguration that he wants to reverse. But now he's having to consult on each of those things, and every time he's getting an overwhelming response saying, no, don't take it out. We want you to keep it. So this happens every time, right? This is the Goodwin curve. If you know Phil Goodwin, Professor of Transport Studies, he first sort of postulated this 2006. He demurs. He says he didn't come up with it. He first saw it on like a napkin at a conference he was at in Edinburgh. But he's the first person to put it in a published paper. And I've had a lot of dialogue with Phil over the last couple of years. He agrees. His study, this was about road pricing in cities, but he agrees it basically applies to any traffic reduction scheme, right? The same thing happens every time. You start out, there's no justification for it. Eventually, you get to the point where everyone's agreed there's a problem that needs solving. And then as soon as the details of what you're planning to do about the problem that needs solving emerge, people start to lose their minds, public support tanks. And then just before implementation, panic. During implementation, chaos. Because it's disruptive. Change is always disruptive. And until a new travel pattern has established, it's like it is disruptive. You get traffic jams where there was no traffic jams before, etc. And then after people have lived with it for a bit, they go, actually, no, this is fine. I like this. And nobody ever wants to go back. So the way we do this, standard consultation responses are heavily skewed towards people with a certain position, protecting the status quo. People are invested in the way things work today. And people are not invested in hypothetical futures, basically, where things might hypothetically be better. So this is a great quote from Susan Claris, who's the walking champion for Arup. People who aren't currently cycling, which we know is a large part of the population, they aren't going to be out there giving support to something to benefit cycling because they don't see themselves as cyclists, so they don't see this as relevant to them. As soon as you build a cycle lane, people start using it, and then it becomes very difficult to take away. But what you won't get is people who don't know they're a cyclist yet, because cycle lanes create cyclists. You just have to do it anyway. So the abstract principle, this is very important, of traffic reduction is actually very popular now. Because the country is drowning in cars, most places where most people live are experiencing traffic blight of some kind. And so you get a very, very consistent response. This is DFT polling, but I could have put up slides from all sorts of different sources. People say there's too much traffic and they would like action to reduce the amount of traffic. Now, they're not thinking of themselves when they say that. They're thinking of all the other traffic. But, the abstract principle is very popular. So even like this is low traffic neighbourhoods, majority support for low traffic neighbourhoods, right? Even in the specific, when you precisely say closing residential streets to through traffic, are you into that? People say yes, yes please. Public polling consistently finds a robust majority of the public support closing residential streets to through traffic. Strong opposition is limited to a narrow group, and that is true nationally. It's true in London specifically, where most low traffic neighbourhoods have been implemented so far. And the government's own very bad faith LTN review, which they had hoped would find something very different, found 2-to-1 support for low traffic neighbourhoods in every area that they looked at. They didn't put that in the headlines, but that is what it said. So this is from London Travel Demand Survey, which, it's not like a massive sample size or anything, but I think it says something very telling, right? Which is that a good half of the driving in London is done by about 10% of people. They're the people who get really super furious about doing anything about it. Just to note, dirty tricks, absolutely de rigueur for people who don't like this stuff. I could have put up a load of slides. I've got like a Twitter thread that I did on vandalism of low traffic neighbourhood modal filters when they were first introduced, because it was like an epidemic across the country. People setting fire to them, poisoning plants, literally pouring poison into flowers. Very weird stuff. But setting up bots to respond to consultations, unless you've guarded against that, you will definitely get that. If you're proposing to do anything about traffic, you're going to get people trying to game it. And this has been a very consistent theme. Again, I could have had loads of things up on that slide. There's this thing, pluralistic ignorance, right? And I think that Ian Walker, who is a psychologist at Bath University, he put this very well, right? Negative voices find it very easy to sway things their way because people have a tendency to misjudge the public levels of support. They're thinking, well, I quite like this, but I don't want to say so out loud because all I can see around me is people who are furious about it. So it deters people from sticking their head above the parapets. And then you very quickly get just echo chamber next door spaces where everyone chiming in is caps lock fury, angry about it. And if you're a local councillor and you log on to Nextdoor as a barometer of how people are feeling, you're like, oh my God, I've made a terrible error. But this is a great MSc project from some students at Imperial, Audrey Denazell. This shows you is massive engagement anti-LTN groups, right? So this is a specific location here, huge numbers of people weighing in to Twitter debates. And then if you just look at the percentage of total votes, the anti-LTN candidates just did absolutely nothing. So that's one place. But look, the broader point is support for low traffic neighbourhoods is there, it's broad, but it is shallow and it is soft. And opposition to them is narrow, but it's hard, deep and pointy. And that makes it very easy to frighten local politicians away from seeing change through. The majority of people who want a change just don't want it enough to get involved in that. You know, they look at that discussion on a Facebook group and they're like, no thanks, I've got other things to do in my life. Walden Forest. This is a fairly famous picture, you might have seen it before. This is the coffin protests. This is Clyde Lokes, a hero of the low traffic movement. He was the first to introduce low traffic neighbourhoods in Walden Forest. Again, 41% of people opposed those low traffic neighbourhoods when they were implemented. This is a large protest, many people on the high street. Death of the high street, that's what the coffin represents, right? They're saying that all the shops are going to die. 2 years later, 1.7% of residents wanted the changes reversed by that point, right? Only the diehards. So does this stuff translate into electoral outcomes? We did a very detailed piece of work with University of Westminster researchers. They had to recruit a bunch of interns to do the Twitter scraping. We did a ward level analysis of every London ward that had an incumbent councillor in an area where there was a low traffic neighbourhood. And we looked at their Twitter feeds for what did they say? Did they say anything? Was it positive? Was it negative? What you're looking at here, every circle is a councillor, an incumbent councillor. As you can see, there was not a single positive tweet from a Conservative councillor in London about low traffic neighbourhoods in the run up to the 2022 local elections. There was only one really negative tweet from a sitting Labour councillor, and that is mainly just a function of the people who are in charge of councils are the ones doing the thing. And, in this scenario, most of the low traffic neighbourhoods were implemented by Labour councillors. Voting outcomes, effects of tweeting at all. If you said something about low traffic neighbourhoods, it had a detectable but not statistically significant effect on your vote share. If that is different for different parties, if you were a Tory councillor, you saw a very slight bounce in your vote share by saying mean things about low traffic neighbourhoods. If you were a Labour councillor, you would see a very slight increase in your vote share for saying positive things about them. The odds of keeping your seat were absolutely unaffected. So there was simply no effect. And bearing in mind, this is in some parts of the city where this was the only thing that the local papers ever talked about. There were national newspaper coverage of the low traffic neighbourhoods. There were lots of posters up. I mean, the councillors involved really thought they were in trouble, and then nothing, literally nothing, which is why we called the report Sound and Fury. So most incumbent councillors didn't say anything. No negative electoral effects of tweeting anything at all. And if there is any effect, it's positive for saying anything. For Labour councillors, saying positive things was good, but you could also just say nothing. It just had absolutely no effect. People don't vote on that. This is Clyde Lokes, his vote share. So back to our friend Councillor Clyde Lokes. Here he is, Walden Forest. What you see in the top half here is the actual deliveries, consultation and then implementation of the low traffic neighbourhoods in Walden Forest against the various election dates and what happened to Clyde Lokes' vote share. Again, you just wouldn't know that he was receiving death threats about implementing that work. Now, there is an exception here, and some of you may be thinking Uxbridge, right? That Uxbridge by-election result has absolutely done terrible damage to environmental policy making and the discourse in this country. And what happened here? This is polling tracking Londoners' attitudes towards air quality as an issue. Is it a problem or is it not a problem, right? The top one, 38%, it's a fairly big problem. The blue line is it's not a very big problem. The orange line is it's not a problem at all. And prior to the ULEZ expansion being announced, nobody thought it wasn't a problem at all. And very few people thought it wasn't much of a problem. And what you see here is, at the point where the consultation on the Outer London expansion was launched, between there and it being confirmed, you can see people just start to decide it's not an issue, right? They literally, you see a shift in the public attitudes, and that is the Goodwin curve in action, right? That is, we've said now there's a problem, we all agreed it was a problem, and before we had consensus that air quality is a problem, we need to do something about it. Now I'm saying I'm doing something about it. People are going, oh no, I've changed my mind. It's not a problem at all, in fact. So that then led to this sort of nonsense. You know, this is Susan Hall's campaign, and I have to say, I don't expect her to win. Please, you know, touch wood. Nothing here is made of wood. It's extremely troubling. But to some extent, she has won already, because she has bullied Sadiq Khan out of road user pricing, which he had previously been the only senior politician with any power in the UK who had been courageous enough to say it was needed. And, you know, that's a great win, actually, for Susan Hall. It's terribly disappointing. It's Chris Bruntlet. I like this quote: if you're not getting death threats, you're not doing it right. This is someone with a lot of experience of trying to transform cities, and this just happens every time. So he's learned to take it on the chin. There's an important clue about the fact that prior to all this low traffic neighbourhood discourse recently, 25,000 of these things, modal filters across the country, no one ever wrote to councillors saying, hey, I want this modal filter removed. So it shows you that it is ephemeral, right? It's something to do with the process. It's not the actual change to the roads that people don't like. We did a bit of door knocker. We went and knocked on doors with people who live on streets with modal filters, and we asked them if they like their modal filter. Would they like us to remove it? Absolutely not. And the longer they lived with it, the more positive their attitudes towards it became. And as soon as we said, what if we removed it? What do you think that might happen? What they did was they were haunted by all these spectres of bad things, right? And what that tells you is that basically change is hard. In any direction, whatever direction you want to take the change, people are going to see problems with the change and struggle to visualize the benefits. I love this Thomas Paine quote: time makes more converts than reason. There is nowhere where this is truer than the domain of traffic reduction. And we're going to have a quick whiz through an object lesson from Hammersmith and Fulham Council. This is their mantra, doing things with, not to residents. So you might be able to see, you might be able to predict where this is going if you haven't followed Hammersmith and Fulham's journey here. But it's a great example of what not to do. So here we are, summer 2019, local residents consultation. They did a commonplace consultation, and it was really clear from that local residents thought rat running, there's lots of rat running through these very narrow residential streets in Brackenbury Village, too much motor traffic, priority issues, right? They wanted something done about them. November 2020, they developed some potential remedies. It includes some modal filters. They did some residents association workshops, you know, just sounding them out. They'd made some visualizations. Doesn't that look lovely? That would be closing it off. So good, nice bit of public realm improvement, some cherry trees. This was very popular. Meanwhile, they'd been doing a modal filter in South Fulham, and they'd been getting an absolute world of hurt from it. And the transport team at Hammersmith and Fulham Council had been overwhelmed. They weren't expecting the level of backlash that they endured. And so they've begun to develop their own unique take. So they don't do low traffic neighbourhoods in Hammersmith and Fulham. They do TCPRs. This slide makes me laugh. This is a slide from Hammersmith and Fulham Council presentation. Tech solution to an impossible problem. We've cut through the Gordian knot. We're not doing modal filters that affect local residents. It's just through traffic. So if you're an out of borough driver, you're fined for driving through the filters. If you are a resident in Hammersmith and Fulham and you vote there, you can drive anywhere you want. And so they were terribly pleased with themselves coming up with this, and they believed that it had solved the problem, right, in advance, and that they would just be able to breeze this stuff through, because who wouldn't want to keep out the external drivers and still be able to drive anywhere you like? That's another one of their slides, just emphasising the point it's not a low traffic neighbourhood, and we're not trying to do anything to you, residents. You can do what you want. Back to Brackenbury, 2021, series of working group meetings to develop plans, lots of focus on minor public realm improvements, no hard traffic measures by this point. They'd already bowed back from that. They'd gone to, it's going to be cameras only, and we're not going to do anything to you. It's just going to be for out-of-borough drivers. So bearing in mind we started in 2019, so 2 years have passed. Meanwhile, look at this, December 2021. This is the first South Fulham TCPR, as they called it, traffic something pollution reduction scheme. The blue is people hated it when they first implemented it. 1 year later, everyone wanted to keep it, right? So this is, do you want this stuff made permanent? They lived with it for a year, 85% of people wanting it. Better Brackenbury, March 2022, detailed report from the 6-month Better Brackenbury Working Party presented to Cabinet. April 2023, public drop-in events are held to show residents the final proposals for the camera enforcement and the bit of tree planting. All hell breaks loose. Immediately, the local motor lobby, led by notorious climate change denier, launched the Don't Kill Brackenbury disinformation campaign. They went and knocked on the doors of all the businesses, saying this is going to destroy your business. So they recruited the business. It was very effective campaigning. Recruited the businesses, who then got their customers to sign petitions saying don't do it. The leader of the council, here's a petition, rapidly wrapped up signatures. The leader of the council absolutely bricked it and cancelled the scheme. Now, this is his ward. So this is the leader of the council. This was going on in his ward. And I went to one of the drop-in events for this. No sign of any councillors, no sign of any officers. It was just a group of men shouting at the consultants. And I was there for about an hour. And that just went on all the way through and defacing the exhibition materials. No one from the council showed up, including the leader of the council, and this is his ward. And this is 2023. This started in 2019. There have been 4 years of very deep dive public engagement to get to this point, when he just pulled the plug on it. 2024, this is this year in February, a very long Hammersmith and Fulham council meeting, which I tuned into on YouTube, finally approved the extension of their first scheme, right? And they made it permanent. Here he is again. This is David Tarsh, the climate change denier who we saw in Brackenbury Village, making his representation. They really did indulge an almost endless stream of malcontents. And listen to all of them. These are just some quotes that I wrote down from things that the councillors were saying in this call, right? Most of the complaints I've heard around this scheme have been about a lack of consultation. But there's been an absolutely vast amount of consultation. This is the deputy leader of the council, right? What that tells you is they just say that. People who don't like this stuff will always say there hasn't been enough consultation. It's not that you did your consultation wrong. You didn't do it badly. This is just something they say. They always say it. Doesn't matter what you did. 4 years of public engagement in Brackenbury, right? People still complaining about lack of consultation. And this is, there's been more consultation on this scheme than anything I've ever seen in all my years as a councillor, right? 8 or 9 public meetings pre-trial, 15 more big meetings since the scheme began. This is a single scheme. What's happening now with the rest of the rollout? There was supposed to be 13 of these things in the borough. This is a FOIA response that was just received a couple of weeks ago by a colleague of mine, John Stone, who's a journalist. What's the status of the programme? Is an outline programme now, and the launch of an experimental scheme is contingent on local community support. Contingent on local community support. But hold on, remember this slide? Right? If the launch of the experimental scheme is contingent on local community support, there's not going to be any more experimental schemes, because this is always true, right? That's what happens every single time. You might have a small group of people saying, we're desperate, we've got a rat run. But that's not going to do it. If they ask people locally, do you want this? They'll say no until they've lived with it. So what does this tell us, right? Appeasement doesn't work. Trying to be clever and get ahead of the motor lobby and go, what is it they'll be upset about? I know, let's make all these preemptive concessions, right? So that they're not affected in any way. It's met with identical levels of fury. Literally identical, like indistinguishable from all these other schemes I've looked at where they just did bollards. 4 years of Better Brackenbury programme spent on the downward slope of the Goodwin curve, right? Just everything just getting worse and worse, basically. And then they bottled it and didn't even do it, and they just wasted all that time. Complicated camera enforcement is a bad idea. it's inferior, right? With all these exemptions that people have asked for, it's just inferior to just point closures and public realm enhancements. That is a much better solution. If you've got a camera scheme that's fining people for driving through the cameras wrong, that's something that the council is permanently doing to people. It's a scheme, and it's going to carry on being a scheme that is enriching council coffers or whatever it is these people want to say on next door. If you just change the road layout and you plant a tree where there used to be a place for cars to drive, now that's a tree. It's not a scheme. So here we are, back to the Goodwin curve, right? You've got to just be very brave here to get anything done. And this is not well understood. So councillors just don't know what they're getting into. They think, well, who would object? It turns out loads of people object, but actually they're worrying about the wrong things. So I love this Bertolt Brecht poem. When it's a notion, when it's vague, it's praised. But when it looms large, when plans are in motion, objections are raised. So look, the summary here. Schemes will always have more visible enemies than friends when you first propose them and when you implement them. That shouldn't be a surprise to anyone, and there is no magic formula that can solve that for you. There's no magic way to get majority support for traffic reduction schemes before you've implemented them, and that should not be a goal or a precondition for action. The end state, once you've done it, is universally preferred. No one ever wants to go back. No one ever wants to go back. You will be shouted at. Councillors will be shouted at. They need to be prepared for that. They're not going to lose their seats. It's like removing a plaster or grasping a nettle, right? The only good way to deliver a traffic reduction scheme is fast. And if you want to be clever about it, don't do it at the bottom of a Goodwin curve when you're standing for re-election, because you can accidentally find yourself in an Uxbridge situation. So this approach that we've got to securing public consent, it just means that the difference between the traffic reduction schemes that succeed and get made permanent and the ones that fail is almost exclusively explained just by the courage and resolve of the politicians responsible. You know, all of the work done by the practitioners on design and public engagement is almost immaterial. It's like, can you see this thing through? You know, have you got the spine to see it through? So finally, remedies. I want to suggest a couple of things that I think will help. So in terms of, do I have a mandate to do this, right? Representative public polling is super consistent. People do want this stuff, but they will not show up. If you do an elective consultation process, you won't hear from those people, right? So do representative public polling. That will tell you, it's a much better indicator, a much better litmus test of local public views than what you'll get in response to consultation. Citizens' assemblies, they're a lot of work, but honestly, every citizens' assembly on climate change that I have seen or been involved with, and I gave evidence to the UK one, produces much more radical recommendations for action than politicians are prepared to countenance. And that's what happened in France, where Macron promised to put everything that they came up with to a vote. And then they came up with a load of stuff, and he was like, oh, no, I didn't mean, I wasn't going to put everything to a vote, and he watered it all down. But, you know, it does work. And then what Camden did, I think, is really smart and is like, this is best practice, right? You co-produce a long-term strategic vision for your neighbourhood with local people where you do a lot of engagement and visioning. It's like, what kind of neighbourhood do we want to live in? Think about it. It's 2025. How do you want our neighbourhood to be? And people will say the kinds of things that we want them to say, actually, right? You write all that down, you get to the point where you've got a vision that everyone's agreed on, and then what Camden has done is they just fast track each individual measure. So they do the minimum 21 days for their traffic management orders for anything that's classed as a small scheme under their framework, because they've already taken it as given. These are the things that are needed to deliver the vision that everybody in the area agreed to 6 years ago. So that is a really, really effective approach, and it does not mean chucking democracy out the window. It does not mean, like, what does the will of the people mean when they always prefer the end state, right? No one ever wants to go back. So then the problem clearly is a change management one. And getting alignment around the vision and then doing the actual work very, very fast. There we are. So to discuss in the panel, thank you very much. I don't know how long. Sorry.
Leo, thank you very much. Fantastic to have such a clear explanation of what's really going on in these, both the local debates, but also you mentioned the plan for drivers and the national debate as well. And I think particularly having all that data from real people involved in this is absolutely critical. Otherwise, it becomes a sort of a shouting match. So I'd like to start with a question. So you mentioned that your sort of, I guess your final conclusion was that what this comes down to is the will and resolve of the political decision makers. But with an audience full of transport planners, not all of whom are members of the Transport Planning Society, what lessons should transport planners advising politicians, supporting politicians with the sort of technical, practical design and planning of this? What lessons should they draw from what you just said, and how can they help their politicians sort of develop that resolve? And
I think that the most important thing is to prepare them for being shouted at.
Yeah.
Because what I've seen again and again, especially in the scenarios where the politicians have caved in and scrapped schemes, is they just were not expecting that level of vitriol to be directed at them. They were not expecting death threats. And they need to know that even if they're just trying to do a parklet, they might get a death threat. It seems implausible, but it is just actually part of the course for this. So, that is showing examples where, these kinds of examples where things were very contentious, and then after you've done them, everybody likes them and don't go back. So, just being like, look, this is normal, and it's probably the hardest thing that you will ever be called upon to do as a councillor, because yes, bins are controversial, whether dog shit is picked up is controversial, but nothing is as controversial that actually sits in your power as a local councillor as this.
Great. I guess a supplementary question. So you've obviously done a lot of work in this area, a lot of research. How are you, as possible, and as Leo Murray, sort of equipping transport planners to have those sorts of conversations with their political...
Well, coming here today,
okay,
this
good.
is an excellent invite.
Yeah.
But we have also done quite a lot of this. So I've done quite a lot of direct engagement as well. So there's a new outfit called the Labour Climate and Energy Forum that has been set up to engage Labour politicians with the scale of the challenge around the climate crisis, because Labour's very at a high level very committed. But Stephen Cowan, who's the leader of Hammersmith and Fulham Council there, he's committed Hammersmith and Fulham to net zero 2030, right? But we're not going to get to net zero 2030 if it's going to take 5 years to deliver every single scheme.
Yeah.
So yes, I did an event with a bunch of councillors last week where we covered a lot of this material actually.
Okay.
So yeah, popularising the Goodwin curve
Yeah.
has been key. Yeah. Because it just is a really, really helpful way to understand how this plays out.
Brilliant. Thank you. Right, so we'll take a couple of questions from the audience. Gentleman there and then gentleman at the back. Kieran, you're right, handing out the mic, is that right? So to delegate that task to you. So, the gentleman there with the blue jacket on. It probably, it might.
Is it on?
Yeah, it's on. So pass down the road, yeah.
Hi, Richard Mann from Midlands Connect. I guess I'm interested in understanding kind of what percentage of carbon reduction this has achieved compared to, say, the percentage we've achieved with conversion to electric vehicles.
Well, to date, it's not very large, and I think it's important to contextualise, right? Active travel schemes and active travel as a mitigation approach, right? So as a transport decarbonisation policy, it's a small share of the total, right? The reason why, well, as I said at the top of this, what we do at Possible is work on things that we know will improve people's lives today. And because car blight cities, actually designing cars out of cities is a very good way to improve people's lives across lots of different dimensions. So it's not just about the carbon, but importantly, strategically, where we need to get to, given the scale of the reduction in car miles that is required, we need to get to a point where people don't feel they need to own a car. And much of that actually is about 15-minute city type stuff, right? It's about having a livable neighborhood, a walkable neighborhood, where most of the things that you need are within walking or cycling distance, and you don't need to take motorized transport at all to do it. The reality is, something like 30% of road miles are the 50-mile plus trips, right? And these kinds of schemes do absolutely nothing about those, unless you get to the point where people have given up their car, and then they probably won't make that trip by car anymore. And there is quite good evidence that is building all the time, because lots of these schemes have gone in. Car ownership does fall inside low traffic neighbourhoods. It does kind of have that structural effect. So it's certainly not the only thing that needs to happen, but the biggest thing, and what would help much more, is large scale investment in public transport. We're not seeing that. But yeah, it's not that we're against EV switching, and in fact we run a project recently with the Care Workers charity and New Automotive, who are a think tank that supports EV switching, for how do you get rural care workers who clock up a lot of miles to drive EVs? How do you get EVs into their hands? And the answer is social leasing, which is a policy that is already working in France. Has actually been paused. But yeah, cars are just not the right solution for cities, fundamentally.
Great. Gentleman there with the mic.
Thanks, Ben. John Carr from the Association of Transport Coordinating Officers, but speaking at the moment on the basis of 40 years of experience in West Yorkshire and York. And I'd like to make a point about councillor behaviour and a point about public behaviour. First of all, in my experience, councillors are fully on board with professional opinion when the policy is approved and as the projects come up for approval. They are relying on their guts when it comes to delivering the final outcomes of recommendations. And I've long thought that if you think back to follow the science and ask whether it actually was followed, maybe if before a certain size of project was implemented, you had to check with your professionals again that it would pass, rather like the government now does with the budget. Would that not be a better way of conducting ourselves with large sums of public money? The second point is about the public. Did people really know what television would be like before Logie Baird put it out on the market? Do people really know what a net zero solution with massive modal shift is going to look like? And I think the answer is, in each case, probably not. You've got to have projects which are expressed in terms which the public can understand, and there I'm wholeheartedly with you on your methods of consulting the public.
Great, John, thank you very much. Do you want to quickly respond?
Yeah, so I think that is so much of the problems that we are encountering with trying to make progress on doing the things that are needed to meet our climate goals actually is underpinned by the source of the problem, is that the government has not been prepared to have an open and transparent conversation with the public about what these commitments they've made actually mean. So, if you look at the top of that presentation, you've got government ministers saying, oh, no, we're not telling people they need to use their cars less. But their own civil servants have absolutely been telling them people are going to have to use their cars less or we can't meet these targets. So it really is the scale of the challenge, right? The scale of societal change that is implied by actually meeting even the net zero 2050 target, which we've got, which, may not be ambitious enough. It's certainly not an emergency response. That requires a massive public engagement campaign to mobilise the people and get everybody pulling in the same direction. And we just haven't. There's nothing. There's been absolutely no attempt to do that whatsoever. The conversation is is nowhere. So the Department of Culture, Media and Sport has no net zero policy, right? Which tells you something. They're just not regarded as having a role in it. And when the government published their net zero strategy, they inadvertently published a paper at the same time that they had commissioned from formerly the Nudge Unit, the Behavioural Insights team, which sets out how it literally said you can't nudge your way to net zero. You know, these are big changes that are going to affect people's lives. Here's good practice in how you engage with the public about these kinds of changes. The government unpublished it comically, farcically, an hour later, and then disavowed it. And we're like, no, that was an academic study. That's nothing to do with our net zero strategy. And, we don't have any plans to tell consumers what to do in this way. Yeah, I mean, we're not going to be able to do it, and without that level of, we need to have a massive public information campaign and be educating people about the scale of the challenge.
Great. So I'll take one more question at this point, and then we'll get the panel up. So, gentleman down here at the front.
Thank you. Hi, David Garcia. I'm not a transport planner, but a civil engineer. No, not a transport planner, but a civil engineer. Good question here. So you have explained very well the local reduced traffic areas, etc. But unfortunately, we live in a country where people's dream is to have a detached or semi-detached house on a nice neighborhood with 2 or 1.5 cars on the driveway sitting there. Okay, whether those cars are electrical or diesel or petrol or hydrogen, whatever. Then it goes the problem that people, unfortunately, in this country do not longer go to buy their meat to the butchers or the fish to the fishmongers, but they take the car to go to Tesco's, as they say with S, Tesco's, and that's the journey. So that's part of my question, how we address that problem, if we can. And the second question is very good, the traffic reduced areas, but how we then take those citizens from A to B, those public transport, outside of London, public transport is an absolute pity. So that's my question.
Okay.
Or comment.
Yeah, I mean, I guess on the first one, yeah, people have. We've done this thing, right? We've deliberately motorised society. It wasn't like an accident. It's like a series of extremely deliberate policy choices that were expressly intended to get people to buy cars and use cars for all of their mobility. You know, we tore up the railways in this country, overseen by a transport minister who had, when he took the role on, transferred all the shares he owned in a massive asphalting company to his wife, and it's effectively absconded out the country at the end after he'd torn up all the railways, and as a multi-millionaire. It was very deliberate, right? It was a process of of deliberate policy choices that took us to the place that we are. And we're going to have to now make a series of deliberate policy choices to try to reverse that. It's really hard because, like you say, spatial planning has set things out in a way that is designed for people to move around by car. So trying to reverse that, extremely difficult. It's not impossible, and I think that one of the key things is micromobility. So yeah, sure, not everybody wants to cycle, but actually micromobility is, we're only just now starting to see the contours of what is possible with small electric battery-powered motors. You know, I've no doubt I in the cycle lane when I cycle to work, I keep being passed by guys on electric skateboards. Whizzing past. I mean, one of them, no help. I'm like, what are you doing, mate? But the point is, Denmark, so Copenhagen, has done this thing where it's incentivized e-bikes, and it's built incredible long distance uninterrupted cycle routes into the suburbs, and the average cycle commute in Copenhagen is like 18 miles, right? Which is very much the kind of length people tend to drive, the distances that you were describing. So I think micromobility has a big role to play here. We can't move where all the houses and shops are, but we can. The 15-minute cities thing is basically, that's the shorthand answer to that question. And then how do we get people from A to B if the A to Bs are a long way apart? Public transport is in a terrible state. Absolutely. And Britain has been particularly bad at this, particularly bad. You know, London has good public transport. Outside of London, there's almost nowhere that has good public transport. And this is partly because of an ideology in the UK Treasury that public transport should not be subsidised, and you don't do revenue spending on public transport. Look around the world, every city that has good quality public transport is not washing its own face from fare box revenue. Absolutely not. No, not a bit of it. Nowhere that has, you know, that's just not how it works. Sensible governments understand that the economic benefits of spending on public transport do not accrue exclusively to the public transport operator, but to wider society, and therefore it's worth spending public money on it. Now, how you change a mindset that has prevailed in the Treasury for decades, you know, I don't know, but it's going to have to change. So I think I'll answer it as well with like a sort of, you know, innovation-y type answer, which is that, you know, I'm all in favour of reversing beaching and reopening lines that we've lost and stuff, but that is like a multi-decadal project and there's not time to achieve that, right? The infrastructure we have is roads, but if you try to do this and make the numbers work with everyone in their own cars driving EVs, I mean, the DFT's own projections is for a 50% increase in traffic miles, right, as a consequence of people switching to EVs. And there's not the room on the roads, and it's not possible to build your way out of congestion. So that is just a recipe for gridlock absolutely everywhere, right? So we think actually, we've been working on this for ages with the Centre for Sustainable Road Freight in the first instance in Cambridge. But bus lanes down motorways with overhead lines, small batteries on coaches and HGVs, pantographs on the roof, so that they're not carrying a battery the size of a house to be able to do these long journeys. And, you know, it sounds fanciful, but genuinely, it's by far the lowest carbon way of doing it. And if you had a dedicated bus lane for just public transport and HGVs, it would be quicker than being on the rest of the roads. And, you know, that's the problem at the moment. Buses are very unattractive because you sit in traffic, but you don't cause any traffic. So separate out the buses on the strategic road network and link up all the places that we currently have a lot of car movements back and forth. You know, most of the miles is intercity miles. So, you know, you can solve a lot of the problem in that way.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. Right, so let's get the three panellists up and then we'll come back to Q&A and discussion after that. So can I ask Aoife Dudley, Ayanda Collins and Lisa to come up, and then we'll ask them to sort of give some reflections and then take some questions as well from the audience. So Aoife Dudley is a principal transport consultant at City Science, where she's been since 2022, having been at Atkins before that, and works on modelling and evaluation to reduce carbon in the transport sector. Ayanda is Operations Director of the Smart Transport Hub, which is a consultancy and is working on issues around reducing car use and decarbonisation. And then Lisa, who's a colleague of mine from the Transport Planning Society Board, has over 25 years experience of working on sustainable mobility, including in particular looking at modal shift away from the car, both in the UK, Australia and the USA. So I'm going to start, Ayanda, with you. What are your reflections on what you heard Leo say? Does it make sense? Is it utter nonsense? Is he a dreamer? And what should transport planners be doing if it's not utter nonsense?
I think it was the opposite of utter nonsense. I think I'm sure like a lot of people in the room kind of resonated very deeply with a lot of the things that he said. I think something you said right at the beginning, which I think is so true, is that this is not an intuitive field to people who aren't experts. And I think that that's where we face challenges in kind of work, the nature of the work being that we have to work with politicians. And I think, unfortunately, how that can kind of come to the surface is that, and what I found before I was in my current role, I was the head of service delivering low traffic neighbourhoods and school streets at the London Borough of Islington. And I got to the point with consultation events where I could tell after 2 minutes of speaking to someone, not even whether they were going to be for or against the schemes. I mean, that you can only tell within 1 second. But I think,
by their badge and their crazy look. Yeah.
I think before that, it's what someone being for or against, what it can come down to is whether or not they think the levels of traffic that they currently are on the roads today is inevitable or not inevitable. And I'm sure many of the people in this room think that it's not inevitable, that, you know, there are things we can do and changes we can make that will reduce the amount of traffic. But there's a level of inertia, I think, that many people suffer from. And I liked what you said about it's an issue of change management, of just thinking there is the amount of traffic there is, and we're always going to have to deal with that, rather than thinking we can make different decisions. So I think, I completely agree that I think it's universal and unavoidable that there will be backlash. And if anything, that it's proportional to is how difficult you're making it to drive. How much you're really making people change their behaviors is what they're going to respond to. And often very viscerally, because they don't want to change their behaviors and they think no one else will want to change their behaviors, therefore nothing will change. And so many of these projects rely on people changing their behaviors. It's such an important part of it. So I think that in terms of kind of what we can do, I agree that the political will is the most important thing, but I think that kind of gives, us practitioners a bit of a free pass in terms of, well, then there's nothing we can do. It's just down to what politicians are going to decide. Whereas I think there's actually a lot of things we can and should be doing, and many people are doing, to give the politicians the bravery they need when they are going right at the bottom of the curve to make the tough decision. So just some of those things in my experience, I'm sure there's a longer list, and I welcome people's thoughts on it, is that, we can help them cut through the noise. I think 90% of what you'll hear in a consultation, just putting a number on it, is going to be back to that, the level of traffic's inevitable, it's not going to change, why are you doing this? But there's always some reflections that come back from a consultation that are actually quite meaningful and should actually make you question the scheme and make you question the design and push you to make it better. So I think it's about identifying what are those things that could change about the design, but still keep the integrity of what the council is trying to do. So cutting through the noise, I think, is important. I think not doing yes-no consultations, which I now in my current role have the pleasure of going across the country, trying to convince people not to do yes-no consultations, even if that's all they've ever done. I think, and I can say this because I'm not British, I cannot believe that this country hasn't learned from referendums and them being a bad thing. I can't believe that there are still places that are doing yes-no consultations. But I think sometimes, and I like that my role is sometimes just giving officers permission to not do it, and be like, there are so many places that are not asking yes or no, do you want to make driving more difficult, essentially, because we know what the answer is going to be, and we know it's not going to be representative of what people actually feel, like many of your good stats pointed out. So rather let people fill a free text box with whatever they think, pull out what's important in there, and I think that's a much better way to get actual insights that can help inform the design, rather than just make it a referendum. And then the third thing is, I think we need to be, and also, sorry, just circling back on that, I think that's how we give politicians bravery. I think it's very difficult to give a politician a consultation result that's saying 90% of people don't want this, but we think you should still do it. I think that's really setting it up to fail. Whereas if you can be like, well, we had mixed responses to this. These are some of the pertinent points that came out. These are maybe some things we could change. There are quite a few people that don't want it to happen, but that's completely normal. And then there's some people who supported it. That's a much better way to be able to reflect feedback back. And then the last thing I think is really important, kind of I'm on this, mission against what I like to call anecdata, which I think is what we as humans tend to do, which is, as soon as we're faced with any sort of data point or any sort of decision, we reflect on our own anecdotal evidence and use that to kind of make generalizations. And I think data-driven decision-making is the best way to kind of really cut through that. I think we need to give them evidence and data that they can give to their residents to show that these schemes do work. So I think giving them data to be able to make the decision based on data, not based on the complaints that are filling up their inboxes, is another really good thing we can do. So yeah, and I think also just, I think there's often a perception that it's easier for, in London and when there's low levels of car ownership. But I think, to the point, Leo raised, it isn't often, because it actually doesn't matter. To the Hammersmith example, it doesn't matter. They had as much backlash as they would have had if they'd done an LTN. And I think even in a London, in Islington, where I worked, where there's 70% of households don't own cars, there's as much backlash as there is in other places. So I think it's, but what they have is they have that stat in their head about how many percentage of people own cars, and that gives them comfort in going into the ballot box. So it's what else can we do for people that don't have that comfort? But yeah, sorry, hopefully that wasn't too long, but that's some reflections.
Thank you very much. Aoife, what are your reflections? How does this kind of played out in your practical experience?
Yeah, So I've been there with the people yelling in your face and saying awful things to you, and believe me, it really made me question, am I doing the right thing? Am I a bad person? Am I harming this community? Took a step back, had a breather and thought, no, this is the right thing to do. But it wobbles you, it shakes you, and it's scary, and I really feel for the politicians. You know, it can be so easy to just say, they had, no spine, they should have just carried on. It's so hard to do that when you're face to face with these people, and lots of us maybe don't come face to face with these people every day. So for me, there were 3 things that stood out: being brave, being belligerent, and telling better narratives. So bravery first. That's the 3rd time that we've heard the word brave today, and for me, it starts with that agreement about the problem that needs solving. We might think that there is agreement and it's really clear what we're doing and why, but I think this is the first stage where people start to bluster and prevaricate and doubt creeps in. It starts really early. Is it about climate change? Is it about air quality? Well, what aboutism? What about if it's about air quality, what about poor economic performance if we take away all of the cars and all of the parking? Is it about climate change? Well, what about transport inequality? What are we going to do about all the people who need to drive? So the whataboutism starts to creep in, and you need to be very brave to stick to your guns and sort of say, no, this is the problem we're solving in this community here right now. We're not going to solve all the problems through this one scheme. So then you move on to needing to be belligerent. So the noisy backlash that Leo was talking about, it is absolutely inevitable. I speak from first-hand experience. But actually, it's not even just when we talk about car reduction. You get noisy backlash no matter what you're talking about. You get noisy backlash if you talk about more choice and more active travel infrastructure. People just hear, more active travel? That means I can't drive so much. I better get angry. So that's the point where you need to be belligerent and you need to say, no, this is what we're doing. We're talking about more choice. I'm not talking about taking away your freedoms. And then that segues into our better narratives. So why... People are scared. Times are changing. I think everyone feels a bit uneasy these days. It's not just in transport, it's the world over. But we have an opportunity to sell this differently, to tell the story in a different way. So, overall car miles need to fall by 20 to 60%. Absolutely, it's a fact. But that leaves 40% to 80% of car miles remaining. And, that's where the EVs can pick up, and that there are options for people in rural areas. I think Ben's going to get onto the rural problem later. And dense urban areas have all of these solutions that already exist to move all of these people around. And most of us live in rural areas. Most of us are not going to be so horrendously affected by this. Things will change, but it won't be that bad. There's so much better to come. So, I don't want to go all Chris Stark and start saying you can fly and eat steak, and nothing needs to change, because it does. It doesn't. Things will change. It just isn't going to be that bad. It's going to be okay. So, I think transport's being sucked into the culture wars, and like Leo said, it's actually got very little to do with tarmac and bike stands, and everything to do with fears about control and change and monitoring and who's watching you. And I think it's an impossible task, and we're sort of on the precipice of this not being about transport anymore. So I'm gonna curve it here, but we need to work out how to claw it back. Otherwise, this is going to be very difficult.
So we need brave, belligerent storytellers to get us through this. Lisa, you've dealt with these issues across a number of geographies, different countries. How is this different in different places, or have you seen the same sort of narrative problems and then political challenges? And what does Leo's presentation make you reflect?
Good question that I wasn't quite prepared for. But
Sorry, okay.
You are right. I think it is different. I think we've gone into a conversation very much around livable neighbourhoods, and I've stood in Islington and Camden, and I've also felt that negativity, so I can put myself there. I think as a nation, dare I say that I think the British will find the problem. They will be more hesitant to change, and certainly when I've worked in the United States, mostly on the West Coast, people are much more open to what's possible and change. And even though there's very much more dominant car culture, there isn't the same resistance to change, I would say. So, but I haven't worked on a livable neighbourhood type scheme. But I think what I would like to reflect on, Ben, is actually taking us a bit away from livable neighbourhoods, because I think, Leo, in your presentation, you also gave us very compelling evidence of reaction to congestion charge, for example. And I think really to achieve the change we need to take this out of our dense central urban areas to, edge of urban areas, smaller towns, etc. So I'm interested in understanding more about those examples where we can, does the argument stand up as strongly in those areas as it might do in central London?
Great. So let's come to that, and then I'll come to the audience in a second. So, Leo, we discussed briefly beforehand. So it's easy to imagine, it's not easy to do, but it's easy to imagine the outcomes in Islington and in Southwark and in Brixton, and probably parts of the central parts of the other big conurbations. I think in my head where the challenge lies is it, as one of the questions raised, is in the kind of peri-urban, low density, greenfield housing, big supermarkets, big industrial parks, big sort of office parks. How do you think we tackle? So there's a more practical, challenging question there as well as the politics. How do you think this plays out in those slightly more physically challenging, spatially challenging geographies? How does that work?
I mean, it doesn't work as well or as easily, right?
Yeah.
So I think the thing about the backlash being pretty universal is right, but of course, how quickly the other end of the Goodwin curve, how fast do people get to the point where actually no, this is all fine? I think in Islington, it's very fast because actually everything's completely fine, and there's not very much more that it needs to be done. Whereas there is quite a lot that would need to be done in the peri-urban areas. So I think for really rural places, actually, and dare I say this as a soldier in the war on the car, cars are fine very much in very rural places. They need to be driving electric vehicles, but it's very difficult to meet people's mobility needs if you are in a very diffuse community and everything's very far away. Not in any way that makes any sense, but for peri-urban places, very populous, many people live there, and they're actually responsible for more miles. They drive more miles than even people in very rural places, funnily enough. A lot of those trips are quite consistent, and they should be servable with public transport and with active travel. So again, micromobility, I'll go back to that Copenhagen example. Copenhagen's not a big city, but it's got suburbs. Previously, people were driving in from the suburbs, and it was very bad for Copenhagen. They didn't want that, and they've invested a lot of money in. It's not just a cycle lane down the side of the road. These are like completely separate infrastructure, which just isn't near any roads, and it's completely uninterrupted, right, end to end. So you've got they've built these things in the places where there was previously a lot of car traffic, right? So I think the new tech with safe segregated infrastructure is really important, but also bus lanes and buses as a precursor to trams, right? So I really like a dedicate a lane or dedicate a whole road, even in some places. Bus gates are very controversial in Oxford at the moment, but it's a really good solution for making buses attractive. And you do that first, and then you work your way up to replacing that with a tram. Once you've got a really busy bus corridor, you've got a business case to put a tram down it. And these things don't have to take decades. I mean, trams, people say to me, no, you can't do trams. In this country, we can't do trams less than a multi-decadal time frame. But other places seem to be able to do it. So I think it must be possible.
Great. Lisa,
Can
I'll
I
come to
just
Lisa.
jump in there that you've now moved to talking about providing additional service. So we've gone from actually the taking something away or charging for it, the reducing, to actually we need to give them alternatives. And what I was very convinced by what you said was, why isn't your response actually talking about pay per mile driving? Because maybe we can take strength from what you've shown that there might be the backlash initially, but afterwards there wouldn't be.
I think, listen, I just want to say I'm very pro pay per mile driving, and that would be another answer that you could give. But I suppose it depends. Like, I don't think we can meet our climate goals without that, right?
Yeah.
I think there's pretty much a consensus emerging. Practitioners who work in this space, academics, civil servants know it. You know, there's a massive hole in Treasury, finances, that's only going to get bigger. Yeah, everybody knows. They just know, but no one wants to own it, right? They don't want to own the backlash, which is why everyone's no one. You know, it's a blink first situation. Yeah. Everyone disowning this thing, like saying no, we're never going to do it. There's definitely a team in the Treasury working on how it's going to work right now, right? But is that the thing? That's not necessarily the story, right? The story I told is probably the thing that you would say to people, well, how am I going to get around? It's like, no, this is going to be okay. Yeah. So I guess that, you know, that's the answer. You basically need both things, right? There's a really brilliant paper called Carrots or Sticks, something like that, right? Which is just super clear. You can't do it without sticks, but if you don't have enough carrot, people might not tolerate the sticks and you might not get away with it, you know? So that's why you need both.
Yeah, and I've seen somebody say you need some genetic modification to get a stick that looks like a carrot. It's a hybrid. Great. Okay, so question to the panel from the audience. The lady there, just towards the back, Kieran.
Thank you, Enrica Papa, University of Westminster. We just finished a 4-year project called Experimenting with City Streets, all about trialing and experimenting changes with small communities. And it seems from your talk, it's so relevant, the timing, to make people understand and learn the change. So, but you didn't mention experimenting in one of your key final solutions. So what is your position on that? Have you experience on how do people react to trials or short-term changes, temporary ones? Thank you.
Okay, so I think the question is, so what's the role of kind of trials and pilots and experiments rather than doing things permanently straight away? Okay, great. So I'll start with you, Laura, and then I might come to you, Andy, as well, because you're giving your work in Islington. Yeah, what's your...
I'm massively in favour, because I think that, you know, you believe it when you see it, right? It's a very suck it and see situation. It's like hard to imagine how it's going to be better until you've lived with it. And you know, one of the things about low traffic neighbourhoods is they're really cheap relative to almost anything else that you can do in terms of the level of the volume of traffic reduction that you get for just sticking a few planters out is massive. There is a danger in it if you do that in a way that isn't attractive. Then it looks like the neighbourhood's got worse, if you see what I mean. A well done one, it has love shown to it. And, you know, if you can see some of the ones that Lambeth have done, where there's rainbows on the road and there's, you know, there's planting, there's seating, the area is visibly improved. And it's all temporary materials, but it's prefiguring a more permanent change. I think it's like essential, really, because you won't get consent for massive spend on a permanent change in advance. So, you know, doing a temporary thing and everyone going, actually, no, this is okay, is a really good way to pave the way. I'm in favour.
And Leander, when you were working in Islington, I'm assuming you did some sort of try before you buy experimental stuff as well to meet Leo's turn, is that right?
Yeah, no, we did. We implemented all the LTNs and a lot of the school streets during COVID. I think, the experimental traffic order function that exists here is really remarkable and it's not used enough. Like, I've sat in meetings with councillors where difficult decisions need to be made, and at the last minute, it's like a great Hail Mary to bring out and just be like, you know what, we could just do it as an experiment and see what happens. And it's like, oh, great, that's exactly what we're looking for. I think it really proves a willingness to listen to the data. Like, it really kind of, and it proves a willingness to kind of show, like, you know, that we don't always know exactly what's going to happen, but let's try it and see together. But I think it buys a lot of goodwill, and the thing is, most of the time they stay in and they're fine. Yeah. Every now and then there's something about the design that doesn't quite work, and it gives you the opportunity to modify and reflect. So I think it's another really critical thing that we can do to help get buy-in.
Great. Well, nearly always when they come out and they don't get made permanent, in almost every example, it never saw the trial through. It didn't get to the end of the trial period because the politicians were being shouted at. And they were like, "This is bad, get rid of it." And that's true in almost every scenario. And I just wanted to say, parklets. Sometimes people are like, "Why are you guys so into parklets?" We have a parklets campaigner. We lobby for councils to adopt parklet policy where communities are able to apply to convert an on-street parking space into a little parklet. But the whole point is it's an experimental repurposing of a car parking space, and usually people really love them. And the first 2 parklets from Hackney have prefigured much more substantive changes to the street space layout in the place where the parklets were. So we really like them as a kind of stalking horse, you know, a little very cheap little intervention, convert a parking space, and then people are like, oh, I like this with plants here, I like this with some seating here, somewhere that you can spend time with neighbours, and then it can lead to, you know, yeah.
Brilliant. Okay, Chris Bure, and then there's a gentleman I think with the beard there, Chris.
Hello, Chris Berry. I want to be a bit challenging here. I do a lot of work with people and just delivered a report on transport-related social exclusion for Transport for the North. And I don't think all the people that oppose things like LTNs are necessarily misjudged lunatics. You know, I know people who, for instance, would argue that a lot of the surveys you quoted are only asking people who live on those LTNs what they think, and they tend to be middle class in better housing. Meanwhile, the traffic's directed to main roads where a lot of poorer people live. And also there's the issue of aspiration and different cultural views. Many people from minority ethnic share a car within large families. They're totally dependent on cars, and if they haven't got cars, they aspire to own one. So, you know, I'm just a little bit worried if we get a little bit, if you like, middle class, we know best for you. And it really gets up some people's nose, I think. Okay, so this is middle class complacency, Leon. I might ask you on that as well. Not that you're middle class and complacent, but just
yeah. So listen, first of all, a lot of what you just said actually does not have any evidential basis, and it's something that we have heard a lot. And when very early on in the Car Free Cities campaign, I had an old friend of mine who I've worked on opposing airport expansion with many years, John Stewart, who used to be chair of the Campaign for Better Transport, said to me, I'm concerned about low traffic neighbourhoods because I'm concerned they may displace traffic from wealthier neighbourhoods to onto streets where poor people live, basically, and people of ethnic minorities and so on. And so the very first piece of work that we agreed to do with the Active Travel Academy at the University of Westminster was to look in London specifically at the demographic makeup of people who live on different road types. And yes, house prices are more expensive on away from main roads, but the income of people who live on main roads in London, a lot of them are high streets. London has a lot of very large, pre-cars, actually, the expensive houses were on the main roads. And London has an old road layout that predates cars. And so a lot of our most expensive houses in stock, our biggest, our grandest houses, are actually fronting high streets, right? There is not a good relationship between income, household income, and whether you live on a main road or a quiet residential street. And we also looked at where had low traffic neighbourhoods been implemented. Oh, by the way, there's not a demographic. There's no meaningful, statistically significant difference, but demographically for any group actually. Do they live on a residential street, or are they more likely to live on a main road? Except for children, who are much more likely to live on residential roads than they are to live on main roads. Otherwise, there's just not really a relationship. Interestingly, if there is a justice dimension to this, it is this. If you live on a main road, you're much less likely to own a car. And that's the only other thing which really jumps out from the stats, right, as being different. So demographically, you're much less likely to have somewhere to store one, but also you probably have a bus stop, which is like feet away from your house. So demographically, there's not the difference there. I see this said all the time. People just refuse to believe the data. And, John Stewart and I are no longer friends. It's been bizarre. He said, look into this. We looked into it. And then what he did was he was like, oh, Rachel Aldridge's biased. you know, I was like, is she, what is she? It was a weird exchange. But we also looked at where had low traffic neighbours gone in, and guess what? The councils that have done most of them, that have been really ambitious, aggressive about it, like Hackney, they've put them into the poorest areas. That's where they've gone. The only borough where the low traffic neighbourhoods that they'd implemented were in wealthier neighbourhoods was Enfield. And ironically, it is because Enfield had taken a position that they would only put low traffic neighbourhoods in where people ask for them. And of course, people in this room will know who asks for that sort of thing is middle class people. And so, you know, a part of the beef with low traffic neighbourhoods is a lack of consultation. Nobody asked for this. It's like, well, if you take that approach, as Enfield did, it has problems of its own. It's got different kinds of problems. So that is just, you know, it was interesting to hear you say that, because like I say, I've heard it many times, and we have really resourced a lot of academic work which has now gone through to peer review, which just, there isn't an evidential basis to these claims.
Aoife.
Yeah, I'd echo that. There was a really interesting paper at TPM last year, free plug for you, about whether traffic from LTNs is replaced on the main road or whether it vanishes. And there was very little evidence that that traffic was just forced out onto the main roads. It, in fact, is replaced by people shifting modes or not making the trip at all. But to kind of... you know, in Oxford with the LTNs, East Oxford, which is where most of the LTNs are, there is all student housing. The students live there. There are some roads which are, you know, it's Oxford, the houses are expensive, but by and large, it's accommodated by students. But I wanted to touch on the other part of what you said, which was to do with the demographics of the people that are affected by this, and you know, I think it brings, irrespective of whether you're right about where they live, I think it brings another really important point about the importance of proper consultation. So why are we not hearing from these people when we go out to do this consultation in the way that we currently do it? Who has ever consulted on an increase in car traffic outside anyone's house? Nobody. We just accepted it's, you go back to your stuff, it's inevitable. You know, you don't get a choice. That's just what happens. But maybe we need to bring these people in, and I can't go into the ins and outs right now of how we deal with people who are time poor, how we deal with people in sort of who work shifts, how we deal with people who have child caring or caring responsibilities, how we bring them into consultation. That's a whole other discussion for another day, but we need to look into that and bring that energy to these consultations for these schemes, because then it prevents us from going down the yes, no, stick a survey out, oh my goodness, everybody hates this route, surprise, surprise. But if you know, we need to look into why people aspire to own a car. How can we change that? You know, do we need to uphold that aspiration? Do they have a right to aspire to owning a car? Do we need to let them fulfill that? We had a great question earlier about, you know, people want that detached house, they want the big garden, they want the 2-car driveway. But it all comes back to land use planning and bringing the stuff closer to the people, you know, that triple access concept. So, yeah, I think... the evidence aside, that's one point, but the consultation aspect is crucial. Nobody likes being yelled at, but there are much more productive ways of having these difficult conversations, which get us to see those people whose voices are never heard, but who are really, really important to have in these conversations. You know, that includes the disabled community, that includes people who don't own a car, that includes, you know, all these people that might not feel like this consultation is for them if we just chuck a survey out and say, good. We need to get comfortable with qualitative data. It's so scary when you get you know, if you've gone down the here's a box, tell me how you feel route, you get so many words back, and it's so daunting. And to get the real richness out of that is very difficult. And I don't think a lot of us are very well trained in that. I think there's a skill gap there in how to deal with vast amounts of qualitative data. And getting the right essence out of it. What are people actually saying? How do you cut through the noise? So I think consultation is that. Is
Great.
it?
So there's a gentleman there with a beard, and then I need to come to this guy who's been very patient. Well, you've all been very patient, but he's been particularly patient.
Thank you, Ben. Roger Blake, formerly Hackney, now with Rail Future. Starting presumption that if we're talking about mode shift, we're actually talking about behaviour shift. And it was only towards the end of the panel session earlier that we began to talk about the use of the price mechanism. So when one looks at things like a tank of fuel, whether it's petrol or diesel, your fully recharged electric vehicle, your season ticket, your travel card, are they all not variations of the concept of stored value? When you buy a train ticket for an individual journey, when you use your contactless, when you buy an air ticket, that's pay-as-you-go travel, yes? So how do we popularise pay-as-you-go driving?
Okay, Lisa, since you didn't ask the question last time, I'm going to come to you with that question. And I'm also interested in this notion of how we sort of think about charging as part of the policy mix to get the behaviour change we need.
I think you've asked us, how do you popularise something that is free today and we want you to start paying for in the future?
No, it's not. That's stored value now. You've already spent to top up your tank. So your next journey,
right, I see, because I see. Okay.
When you tap in contactless, that's the point you're paying.
Yes, okay, no, I'm with you. I don't know. I actually wonder if EVs is part, the way that we transact with the fuel station is maybe what needs to change. I don't have an immediate thought on this.
I love that. So, this is about the marginal cost of your journey. At what point do you experience the pain of paying for it? And there's multiple studies have shown that people underestimate the cost of owning a car by a good 50%. They think it is costing them across the whole of the life of the car. They think it's costing them half as much as they're actually spending on owning a car, because they don't, when they go and get in the car, encounter any cost. They just drive off, nothing happens. And they really did those things. They paid for the insurance. They did all the other stuff. So find a way to visibilise. If you flip your question around the other way, find a way to visibilise. It's not a word.
Yeah, but we like it though.
Surface those costs of being a car owner, so that you're experiencing them in more like the way that you experience the cost of the other things. But also potentially doing what you're suggesting, I think, which is to turn the marginal costs of journeys by other means into something which is already a sunk cost and which you're not experiencing as a cost as you go about your business.
Go.
Sorry, I would just add that I think we've kind of, it's a difficult starting point to start with kind of how do we try and get people to get on board with this and see it as something that they agree with, because I think it's back to this point of people I don't think will ever really initially have a positive response to it. But I think for me, a lot of it's about what is that funding going to be used for. That's what we can get people to have a positive response to. In the same way, I think people, when conversations get tough and, around allocating road space and it comes to public transport, you're going to have a very hard time to find someone who says that bus users aren't important and shouldn't be prioritized. So I think if there's a very clear connection for the person paying that this funding is used to fund public transport and to fund faster trains, I think it will change the nature of the conversation. But I also think fundamentally we need to be verbalizing and quantifying very clearly the costs to society of people driving in a way that is super crystal clear that, you're not paying for it now, but someone else is paying for it ultimately. And I just think it's to the point, and sometimes I think it's actually a bit of a curse. It's a blessing and a curse that, what Leo was saying earlier, that it even if it wasn't for climate change, we would want to do this stuff. I agree with that. It's kind of, it's one stone, many birds. But that actually makes it difficult, because then you try and say all the benefits all the time, and then it kind of sounds too good to be true at a certain point. It's like, how can changing one thing help so many people? But I think with this, we need to do that way. And I just think in the beginning it won't be popular, and then people won't remember that it wasn't ever like that, and they weren't paying for it, and then that will be that. I think we fundamentally as society need to agree that the right thing to do should be the cheapest, easiest thing to do, which it isn't now. It's the opposite. Yeah.
Great. Okay, so gentleman here, and then I'll go to James at the back.
Thank you. Mark Selby, Project Beyond. Firstly, Leo, I'd just like to say that was really encouraging to hear. I was not familiar with the Goodwin curve, and I'm very encouraged by that. However, Whenever I'm in London, I'm originally from London, and the word rural is mentioned, there's always this, I'm not saying any of you have said it, but there's always this air that when we say rural, we're imagining Eddie Grundy standing beside a pub and a pond watching a cow, okay? And actually, of course, in terms of road mileage, Hampshire and Surrey have virtually the same road mileage as London, okay? And if you look at Hampshire, it has colossal road mileage, but it's largely rural, okay? And here we have, in the north of Hampshire, 86% of bus services have disappeared in the last 15 years. Now, when we're looking at the policies and encouraging people to bring LTNs in, it's marvellous. But there is, of course, in many of the big cities, that alternative mode of transport. Mm-hmm. And where public transport doesn't exist, we have a problem. Now, on the one hand, we can look at, yes, we need to invest in those services, clearly. But we all know that budgets are not plentiful for doing it. I wonder, given that as I travel around Britain, I keep finding these brand new mobility hubs that have had millions spent on them, and they're sitting there as white elephants because there are no buses that actually go to them now. Okay? So I'm just wondering whether we need to come back to this behavioural aspect. We know that people are predictably irrational, and as has been said, people aspire to owning a vehicle. Okay? We also know that if you tell anyone not to do something, they will resist it like hell. You know? Tell a smoker not to smoke, and he knows every reason why he should be smoking. If he wants to improve his tennis, then he will stop smoking.
Okay. So is there a question?
Yes, there is.
Okay, just checking.
Well, the reason I'm going is there a risk that we're not looking at these behavioural aspects and we're causing people to look at how they can use other modes of transport rather than rational on cost or other purposes, them going with them? Somehow I feel we're looking at rational arguments when we should be looking at other behavioural sciences.
Okay. So Lisa, I'm going to come back to you again because I know that you did a lot of work on this on the States in particular, but the whole kind of behaviour change process. Tell us a bit more about how we might be using that approach in this conundrum.
Yeah, the example that came to my mind as you were talking there, and I think probably because you started on rural, I actually live in a village in Surrey outside of London, and I'm also a parish councillor, and we have bus stops in the village that have absolutely no information on. You would never know it's a bus stop, no flag, no timetable, etc. One of the things we did was liaise with the necessary authority to say, could we just have a flag? So we now have, literally as of about 3 weeks ago, 2 because the drivers of the buses didn't even know that was where the bus stop was. I can't believe how it's really been incredible, the really positive reaction we've had from residents to the fact these bus stops are there. They now know the service is there. We're publicising that it's a £2 fare, blah, blah, blah. And I just think that we've not talked about the information gap today, and that's really where my background of behaviour change has always been, actually just helping people know their options, because they will only change if the benefit derives to them. Your example of tennis v giving up smoking, and we've really got to spend more time on that, as well as convincing our politicians. Yeah.
Right. Okay, I'm going to take one more question because I'm conscious of time and I'm very keen to spend City Sciences tab behind the bar. So James at the back, and then we'll wrap it up.
As I've got the microphone in my hand, can I just say that congestion charging is moving from the Soviet model to the Tesco's model. The Soviet model is it's all owned by the state, it's all free, everybody queues. It's not in anybody's interest to do that.
Shameless exploitation of his role there by Kieran.
Thank you.
James.
So James Cleave, I'm Transport Planning Society board member, but also in my spare time I'm actually a councillor as well. And what's kind of the best way to describe this? I think there's a certain naivety as to kind of what the role of the councillors are, and the sheer amount of bravery which is actually required in order to make a decision. So I'm a town councillor. I really not really responsible for much, but me and my colleagues, we have received death threats over things. In fact, female colleagues have actually received worse than that. And when you actually receive that, it really kind of does make you question why on earth you're doing something. And so almost like what this experience has taught me is there needs to be something which us as professionals can do, not only just to provide the evidence and provide the confidence within counsellors that it will be all right on the night, in effect, but actually is work with them to build up their resilience to that kind of quite personal attacks which you'll receive. And I'm just kind of interested in the perspective of the panel in terms of what can we almost do as professionals which we're not doing right now in order to build up that resilience. Because believe me, you kind of think you've seen something on social media, it's absolutely nothing compared to what you receive in private.
Okay, so perhaps that helpfully sort of ends where we started, James, which is sort of how do we, as transport planning professionals, help give the political decision makers the courage, the resolve that they need in order to get past the bottom bit of the Goodwin curve. So I'll go this way.
Yeah, I mean, I've said quite a few things on it, so I won't say too much. But I absolutely don't underestimate the bravery. I mean, I think of councillors and officers. I think it actually, even though I've left Islington regularly, I'm in touch with my lead members still. I think it brings councillors, officers very closely together, and they have similar experiences in it. I think that's something that I learned a lot from my cabinet member at Islington, was being able to kind of separate what questions and that come from the public are political versus officer questions, and where it's actually about the mechanism of the scheme and how it's working and the data and the evidence. That's an officer question. Where things start getting political about who decided this, that's when councillors are well equipped to make the decisions about how to respond to how decisions are made. So I think the roles and responsibilities of councillors and officers need to be clear. I don't think it's fair to expect councillors to have the technical background and knowledge on all of the many topics they have to deal with to answer those questions. So I think that's one thing, just kind of being really clear about where the responsibilities lie so that everyone can perform to their best where needed.
Great.
Spot on. So, brilliant. That's a brilliant question, James. And where we wound up, so our funding for our Car Free Cities programme, the funder that had funded it just disappeared off the map. They stopped funding. They're called Quadrature Climate Foundation, and they've been funding all sorts of different things, and they just completely vanished off the map about 18 months ago. So we weren't able to take this forward. But where we landed from a lot of dialogue with councillors from different political backgrounds who'd been trying to deliver change was that actually one of the most helpful things that we could do is just bring councillors together into like a peer support group, so that they're at different points along this journey, right? And some of them are on the sunlit uplands at the other end. They've done the thing, they got the death threats, now it's all over, and actually everything's fine. Others of them are at the bottom of the Goodwin curve, and everyone is shouting at them, and they're receiving death threats. So we realised that actually nothing would be more helpful at doing what you said. You described it as building resilience. That me as a campaigner telling them it's going to be all right, fine. Same goes to a certain extent with officers. What they need is other politicians who've come out the other side. It was complicated because you can't have a WhatsApp group of Lib Dems and Labour. Do you know what I mean? At the same time, but we could see the way that we wanted to do it, and I still think that is like probably the most helpful thing that we could do. We're not transport planners, but a civil society just convene those groups so that they're able to talk to each other, share experiences, and
brilliant
camaraderie.
Thank you. Aoife, what's your courage remedy?
So I'm coming at this from a consultant's point of view, rather than someone who's sort of been on the other side of the fence. So I think for consultants, we need to show our officers and our counsellors that we're with them on the journey. It can be hard if you're, if you're commissioned to do the scheme and not the public consultation, but where we have an opportunity to go out and physically be there and support counsellors and officers, it really helps. I mean, I know how much I valued, we had a tricky consultation in Shropshire about local cycling and walking infrastructure plan. I know how much I valued the officer being there. It was huge, and I hope it was the same for her, knowing that we were stood behind her and beside her, and we were going to get her out of any tricky questions and be able to stand up and say, oh, well, actually, this is the evidence that we use for this, or this is where that data came from. And then so that kind of segues to that education piece. So these schemes that we work on as consultants can get very muddy and full of jargon, and it's very complicated, and we might not be as lucky as we are with James to be working with a professional transport planner. These counsellors can get really lost very easily. So being super clear about exactly what's being done, what is not being done. So when they're faced with people who are saying, you're doing this and you're closing that and you're taking away this, is that what's happening? If they know on their rap sheet the key points of what they're delivering, they're far more likely to know when to myth bust and when to kind of come up against that, these sort of lies or whatever that have been going around on Nextdoor, versus when to say, yeah, no, actually we are doing that and this is why. So yeah, arming them with the right knowledge in a really clear, non-technical way, I think that's really our responsibility as consultants.
Brilliant. Finally, Lisa, what's your...
I would just underline what Leo said, a peer support group, you know, sharing the stresses, learning from the success, evidence of the success, and getting the media on side. Wouldn't that be nice if someone could
Good luck with that.
news stories? So.
Listen, we could have gone on for hours, I'm sure. I know there are lots of questions that didn't get asked, so I'm sorry that you weren't all able to ask your questions. So I think we've heard that we need brave, belligerent storytellers supported by really well-informed professionals, whether they're consultants or officers. Leo stressed the fact that we need real honesty about the scale of the changes that we all need to make, both individually and collectively, to not least to achieve our carbon targets, but also to bring about a world that's going to be better in many other ways. Something really important based on the brave bit about resilience and enabling decision makers to sort of weather the storm of being at the bottom of the Goodwin curve. Some really interesting stuff around both engaging in the right way, how we engage with people likely to be affected by these changes, and the importance of experimenting as part of that engagement. And then finally, for me, something very interesting about the need for both carrots and sticks, and that the carrots and sticks will vary depending on where you are and what you're trying to achieve. So what will work in suburban Manchester is not the same as what will work in the heart of central or inner London. And we need to be really clear about the mix of things we need to do. So can I thank very much indeed Leo Murray for opening up the conversation in such an interesting and stimulating way, to Aoife, Ayenda and Lisa for contributing to the panel. Thank you very much to all of you for coming and for all your questions, and to Kieran in particular for being my charming assistant and carrying the microphone around. You've got a job there if you want one, Kieran. So I'm glad to say that Aoife and her companies are going to put their credit card behind the bar, which is fantastic, from City Science. So Aoife, thank you very much. The bar is just out here. I think we're able to stay there till 9, I think, from what my colleague from the ICU said. So let's all repair to the bar and enjoy City Science Hospitality. Thank you very much for your time, and I hope you had a good evening. Thanks a lot.